Hello, and welcome to Channel 25 Morning News for February 14th, 2008. I'm your host, Kyle Englander, here to brief you on the most pressing issues for the day. Without further ado, let's get started. Today, I am thankful to be joined by our President, George W. Bush, who will be discussing the nation's plan to combat the recession we are currently experiencing. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome for the 43rd President of the United States.
Thank you for having me today, Kyle.
The pleasure is all mine, Mr. President. So let's get right into it. As of last night, February 13th of 2008, reporters at the Capitol have received word that with the support of both the Senate and House of Representatives, you signed into law what is now known as the Economic Stimulus Act. Tell us a little about this.
Sure thing, Kyle. As much as the public knows, we are in a recession of sorts, one that may be the worst we've seen since the Great Depression. The housing market has collapsed, and banks, homeowners, and investors are now stuck with worthless assets. Congress has taken this issue very seriously, as we are aware of the volatility it brings to the global economy. Because of this, Congress, along with myself, have developed this piece of legislation to hopefully reverse the damaging effects of this financial crisis.
Glad to hear that, Mr. President. People all throughout the nation are looking for some sort of assistance on this matter. So hopefully this turns out to be effective. Before we get into the nit and grit of this law, describe the process of getting bipartisan approval on this bill and what it took to get that.
Well, Mr. Englander, I'm glad to say that both Democrats and Republicans were able to work across the aisle to get this bill passed. This piece of legislation was passed as our founding fathers would have hoped for. No executive orders or unilateral executive powers were used in this passing of the bill. Instead, a bill was drafted up in the House of Representatives on January 29th of this year. This was then revised slightly by the Senate on February 7th and was met by the House's approval on the same day. I signed this bill into law 6 days later, on February 13th, just yesterday in fact. And as said earlier, Republicans and Democrats worked cooperatively on this bill and were able to get this ball rolling rather quickly. A great display of teamwork, in my view.
Happy to hear that, Mr. President. With so much divisiveness often seen in Congress, I'm glad that everyone is able to rally around this law to promote the needs of American citizens. With that being said, what can you say in terms of the specifics of this law? What is going to change so that the American economy can get back to where it once was?
Sure, Kyle. I'd be glad to speak on this issue. For years, America has operated under the idea of laissez-faire economics, where the economy takes care of itself. It is the purest form of free market capitalism. However, with the recession we are in, the government has got to get involved if we are hoping to correct the economy. What we plan to do with this law is quite simple. Cut taxes, increase spending, and expand social programs to foster economic growth.
That sounds like a legitimate strategy, Mr. President. Are there any raw numbers that you could provide us to give us the true scope of this act?
Sure thing, Kyle. This law is meant to be pretty comprehensive. First, we will be issuing $212 billion in tax rebates. Secondly, $267 billion will be raised for social services, such as food stamps and unemployment benefits. Lastly, $300 billion will be raised for new governmental spending, such as infrastructure, research, etc. All of this in culmination should hopefully spur economic growth under Keynesian economic principles. By giving the people more money and improving services for the country, economic confidence will likely be instilled into the everyday consumer.
I like the sound of that, Mr. President. Just to clarify, this will be a federal order, correct? The power will be vested in the federal government, not the state government, as I understand.
Yes, this will give power to the federal government. By spending more, we will follow a traditional liberal economic view, while taking a conservative outlook on reducing taxes. I'd like to reiterate that both Republicans and Democrats conjointly support this law.
Once again, I'm glad to hear that, Mr. President. How will this law get paid for, though, and who will be the direct beneficiaries of the act?
Being a federal program, the government has cited Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution, which states that the federal government has the power to levy taxes. With federal funds obtained from prior and future tax revenue, we will fund this law, and it will predominantly help the lower-income Americans who defaulted on their mortgage payments.
On a more negative note, Critics have been skeptical of the fact that taxpayers who file their tax returns jointly may not be eligible for payment if any person on return filed with an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, instead of a social security number. Many fear that this will prevent legal alien residents and even overseas military families from receiving any payment. This could possibly affect roughly 1 million legal residents and thousands of U.S. troops negatively. What is the purpose of this exclusion?
Well, Kyle, this is a problem that will possibly have to be addressed in the future. This exclusion, however, was all an effort to prevent illegal immigrants from getting stimulus checks and taking taxpayer money away from low-income American citizens. But as you said, this has caused some issues that may have to be addressed.
I'd be glad to cover any further amendments to this law, and possibly be lucky enough to have you, Mr. President, on the show again.
I'd love to.
Thank you for your time today, Mr. President. We all here at Channel 25 truly appreciate it.
And thank you, Kyle, for providing this law with the necessary coverage to spread its message.
Hello, and welcome to Channel 25 Morning News for January 1st, 2009. Today, we're going to take a look back at the Economic Stimulus Act passed nearly 1 year ago. It is safe to say that it was on the whole successful. Within the first week, average household spending increased by 6%, and for the preceding year, it increased by an average of 3.5% every following week. We here at Channel 25 are happy to say that the country is back on track to economic prosperity.